No ancient civilization lasted as long as Egypt. Its empire spanned more than 3,000 years, outliving every other great power of the ancient world. What made this civilization so different? The answer lies not in one single factor, but in a perfect storm of geography, belief, and innovation. In this video, we will explore the core reasons why Egypt stood apart from Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, and every other ancient society. From the predictable rhythm of the Nile to the concept of divine kingship, from the obsession with the afterlife to the construction of the pyramids, each element worked together to create a civilization that was truly eternal. You will discover how the Egyptians harnessed their environment, built an enduring political system, and developed a worldview that shaped human history in profound ways. How did a single river shape a nation's soul? And why did the pharaohs believe they could conquer death itself? By the end of this journey, you will see ancient Egypt not just as a collection of monuments, but as a living blueprint for human ambition. What do you think makes a civilization truly immortal? The Nile River was ancient Egypt's greatest gift. While other civilizations struggled with unpredictable rivers or scarce rainfall, the Egyptians enjoyed a natural rhythm that rarely failed. Every year, around the same time, the Nile rose gently and flooded the surrounding plains. This was not a violent disaster like the flash floods of Mesopotamia. It was a slow, dependable surge that carried rich silt from the highlands of East Africa. When the waters receded months later, they left behind a layer of dark, fertile soil along the riverbanks. The Egyptians called this land Kemet, meaning the Black Land, and it was the foundation of everything they built. Because the flood was so predictable, farmers could plan their planting seasons with confidence. They sowed barley and emmer wheat after the waters retreated, and they harvested plenty. This agricultural surplus meant that not everyone had to work the fields. Some people became scribes, priests, builders, or artists. For the first time in human history, a society could support a class of specialists who did not produce food but instead organized labor, recorded knowledge, and designed monuments. The Nile's reliability gave Egypt a stability that other ancient cultures could only envy. But the river was more than a source of food. It was the highway that connected the entire country. Boats made of papyrus reeds or wooden planks carried grain, stone, timber, and people from one end of Egypt to the other. There were no roads in the modern sense, and the desert was unforgiving. So the Nile became the main artery for trade and communication. A pharaoh could send a message from Memphis to Thebes in days, not weeks. This easy movement of goods and ideas helped unify Upper and Lower Egypt into a single, centralized state. Rulers could project their authority along the entire length of the river, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and organizing massive building projects. The contrast with other early civilizations is striking. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably, often destroying villages and irrigation canals. In the Indus Valley, the river system shifted course, forcing cities to be abandoned. Egypt's Nile, by contrast, provided a steady, manageable cycle that lasted for thousands of years. That reliability allowed the Egyptians to develop a worldview of order and continuity. They believed that if they honored the gods and the pharaoh, the river would continue to bless them. This harmony between nature and society became the bedrock of their civilization, and once that foundation was secure, they could turn their attention to the mysteries of death and the afterlife. What happened when a society no longer had to worry about its next meal? It could dream of eternity. The political unification of Egypt was itself a masterpiece of symbolic power. Before the first pharaohs rose, the land was divided into two distinct regions, the narrow valley of Upper Egypt in the south and the broad delta of Lower Egypt in the north. Each had its own traditions, its own gods, and its own crown. The white crown of the south and the red crown of the north were worn separately for centuries. Then, around 5,000 years ago, a ruler from the south named Narmer or Menes, depending on which tradition you follow, conquered the north and brought both lands under a single authority. But the Egyptians did not erase the old identities. Instead, they wove them together into a powerful concept, the two lands. The pharaoh became the ruler of both, and his authority was symbolized by the double crown, a combination of the white and red crowns fused into one. That crown was not just a piece of headwear. It was a visual statement that unity was the source of strength. Every time a pharaoh appeared in public, he reminded his people that Egypt was whole. This idea of duality ran deep. The country was always referred to as the two lands, even when it was firmly united. The pharaoh was called the Lord of the Two Lands, and his throne was placed at the exact point where Upper and Lower Egypt met, near the city of Memphis. This unification was remarkably stable. While other ancient empires rose and fell within a few generations, Egypt's monarchy endured for over 3,000 years. There were periods of division, of course, like the intermediate periods when regional governors grew powerful or foreign invaders took control. But the ideal of a single, divinely appointed king never faded. Each time order was restored, the pharaoh was said to have reunited the two lands once again, as if history was a cycle of chaos and renewal. What made this system so resilient? Part of the answer lies in how the pharaoh was perceived. He was not just a political leader. He was a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon deity. His role was to maintain cosmic order, known as Ma'at. If he failed, the Nile might not flood, the crops might wither, and chaos would return. So obedience to the pharaoh was not merely patriotic. It was a spiritual duty. This fusion of religion and government gave the monarchy a sacred authority that no challenge could easily break. A rebel might overthrow a king, but he could not overthrow the idea of kingship itself. And because the pharaohs typically passed power from father to son, the dynasty provided a clear line of succession that most people accepted. For generation after generation, the same rituals, the same titles, and the same symbols reinforced the message that Egypt was eternal. Compare this to Mesopotamia, where city-states fought each other constantly and kings had to justify their rule through military success. In Egypt, the pharaoh's legitimacy was built into the fabric of the universe. This stability allowed the Egyptians to invest in enormous projects over centuries, not just decades. They could quarry stone, transport it hundreds of miles, and build monuments that took a lifetime or more to complete. They knew the same dynasty would still be there when the work was finished. That kind of long-term thinking was rare in the ancient world, and it was made possible by the early political unification. The double crown was more than a symbol of conquest. It was a promise that the two lands would remain one, and that promise held for millennia. So what happened when that sacred monarchy turned its attention to the greatest mystery of all? The pharaoh was a living god, a bridge between the mortal and the divine. In no other ancient civilization did a single human being hold such absolute spiritual authority during their lifetime. Mesopotamian kings claimed to be chosen by the gods, but they were not worshipped as deities. The Egyptian pharaoh was different. From the moment he took the throne, he became the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky. And when he died, he would merge with Osiris, the god of the underworld, only to be reborn as a new Horus in his successor. This cycle of divine transformation meant that the pharaoh was never truly a mere man. He was a cosmic necessity. Without him, the universe itself would fall into chaos. The key to understanding this power lies in the concept of Ma'at. Ma'at was not a law or a set of rules. It was the fundamental order of the universe, a principle of balance, truth, and justice that kept the stars in their courses and the Nile flowing each year. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Maat. He did this by performing rituals, building temples, offering sacrifices, and ensuring that justice was served in the courts. Every action he took carried cosmic weight. If he failed to uphold Ma'at, the world would tip into Isfet, the opposite of order. Crops would wither, the desert would encroach, and the forces of chaos would overwhelm Egypt. The people saw the pharaoh as the only barrier between harmony and destruction. This belief was not just abstract theology. It played out in daily life through ceremonies and monuments designed to reinforce the pharaoh's divinity. When the king appeared at the great festivals, such as the Opet festival in Thebes, he would process through the streets in golden regalia, accompanied by priests and officials. The crowds would bow, not just out of loyalty, but out of spiritual reverence. They believed that seeing the pharaoh was a form of blessing. His presence literally renewed the land. This was a far cry from the kings of other early empires, who often had to prove their right to rule through military victories or political maneuvering. The pharaoh did not need to prove anything. His divinity was inherent, passed down through the royal bloodline back to the gods themselves. Even the architecture of the palace reinforced this idea. The palace was called the Per Nesu, meaning the Great House. It was not just a residence but a sacred space where the divine king interacted with the gods through ritual. The throne room was designed to resemble the horizon where the sun rose, symbolizing the pharaoh's role as the source of light and order. When foreigners visited, they were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the royal court. The pharaoh rarely spoke directly to visitors. Instead, officials conveyed his words. This distance created an aura of mystery and power. The king was not someone you could approach casually. He was a force of nature. This fusion of political and religious authority gave Egypt a stability unmatched in the ancient world. While other civilizations experienced frequent dynastic changes and civil wars, the Egyptian monarchy remained remarkably consistent for centuries. Even during periods of foreign rule, the invaders often adopted the title of pharaoh and performed the same rituals because they understood that the system itself was the source of legitimacy. The divine kingship was not just a belief. It was a practical and enduring political structure that held the two lands together through every crisis. And it made the pharaoh's obsession with death something far more profound than fear. It was a mission to ensure that even after leaving this world, they would continue to uphold Ma'at forever. So how did they prepare for that eternal journey? To a people who believed their king was a living god, death was not an end, but a transformation. The Egyptians saw the afterlife not as a distant shadow, but as a continuation of existence, a journey that demanded intense preparation. At the heart of this worldview stood Maat, the principle of cosmic order, truth, and balance that every soul had to honor. Maat governed everything: the rise of the sun, the flooding of the Nile, the honesty of a merchant in the market, and the justice a judge delivered. Living in harmony with Maat meant acting with integrity, kindness, and respect for the gods. But the most profound test of Maat came after death. The Egyptians believed that when a person passed away, their heart, the seat of their thoughts and deeds, was weighed against the feather of Maat in a great hall of judgment. The god Osiris presided over this ceremony, surrounded by 42 assessor deities. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul was declared justified and could enter the field of reeds, a paradise mirroring the best of Egypt. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it would be devoured by a fearsome creature, part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. That second destiny was annihilation, a complete erasure from existence. This belief was not merely a comforting story. It shaped every major decision an Egyptian made. They built their tombs during their lifetimes, stocked them with food, furniture, tools, and even small statues called shabtis that would perform manual labor in the next world. The more elaborate the preparation, the greater the assurance of a comfortable afterlife. This is why the pharaohs invested such enormous resources in their pyramids and hidden valley tombs. They were not just monuments to ego, they were eternal homes engineered to protect the body and the soul. The preservation of the body was essential because the Egyptians believed that the spirit, called the Ka, needed a physical vessel in order to enjoy the offerings and pleasures of the next world. Mummification was a sacred art, a process that could take 70 days and involved removing certain internal organs, drying the body with a salt called natron, and wrapping it in layers of resin-coated linen. Priests recited spells and prayers during each step, guiding the soul through the dangers of the underworld. The organs themselves were placed in special jars, each protected by a god. The heart, however, remained inside the body because it was needed for the weighing ceremony. This elaborate care for the dead was not reserved only for royalty. Wealthy nobles and commoners who could afford it also sought mummification, though with simpler methods. The desire for eternal life cut across social classes. And because every Egyptian wanted to be remembered and sustained, they commissioned autobiographies on tomb walls, left letters to the dead, and participated in festivals that honored ancestors. Religion was not a Sunday activity. It was woven into the fabric of getting up, eating, working, and sleeping. Every village had its local deity. Every home had a shrine. Every major event from planting to childbirth involved prayers and offerings. The temples were not just places of worship. They were economic centers where priests managed land, herds, and workshops. The state itself was a religious institution. The pharaoh was the chief priest of every god, and his officials served as priests in his name. This integration meant that the boundaries between the secular and the sacred barely existed. Building a pyramid was a religious act. Painting a tomb wall was a religious act. Writing a letter was often a religious act, because the scribe would invoke the god Thoth, the patron of writing and knowledge. This worldview produced an extraordinary body of religious literature. The pyramid texts carved into the walls of the 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids are the oldest known religious writings in the world. They contain spells to protect the pharaoh on his journey. Later came the coffin texts, which democratized the afterlife by offering protection to anyone who could afford a coffin inscribed with these spells. By the New Kingdom, these evolved into the Book of the Dead, a collection of nearly 200 spells, illustrations, and instructions that helped the soul navigate the underworld, answer the questions of the judges, and avoid the traps set by hostile demons. No other ancient culture produced such a detailed guide to the afterlife. The Mesopotamians saw the underworld as a gloomy, dusty place where all souls went, regardless of their deeds. The early Greeks described a shadowy realm ruled by Hades, but the Egyptians painted a world of judgment, reward, and possibility. They believed that with the right knowledge, the right spells, and the right moral life, a person could overcome death itself. This belief in resurrection, in the renewal of life after death, set them apart. It is why they built with stone instead of mud brick. It is why they carved their names so deeply into granite. It is why they left behind so much. They were not just building for their own time. They were building for eternity. And that obsession with the next world gave the ancient world its most enduring legacy. But how did a society that focused so heavily on the afterlife manage to create such vibrant, practical innovations in medicine, mathematics, and engineering? The Great Pyramid of Giza rises from the desert with a precision that still baffles engineers today. Its base covers more than 13 acres, and each side aligns almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. The average error in the pyramid's right angles is less than 1/20th of a degree. This level of accuracy was achieved around 4,500 years ago using copper chisels, wooden levers, and simple measuring tools. No other ancient civilization came close to matching this feat until the modern era. The sheer scale is staggering. The pyramid contains about 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons. Some blocks in the internal chambers weigh as much as 80 tons. The builders had to quarry these stones from distant sites, transport them across the Nile, and lift them into place without the use of wheels, pulleys, or iron tools. How did they manage it? The answer lies not in magic or lost technology, but in extreme organizational skill and an enormous, well-fed workforce. For a long time, popular stories claim that slaves built the pyramids under brutal conditions. Recent discoveries have changed that picture. Archaeologists have found workers' cemeteries near the pyramids, with well-cared-for skeletons, evidence of healed injuries, and traces of a diet rich in meat and bread. These were not slaves. They were skilled laborers, farmers during the flood season, and specialized craftsmen who rotated in shifts. The state fed them, housed them in temporary barracks, and paid them with rations of grain, beer, and fish. A single worker was allotted about 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, enough to sustain heavy physical labor. The organization behind this was a marvel in itself. The royal administration recorded every shipment of stone, every tool issued, and every day's rations on scraps of limestone and pottery. Scribes tracked the movements of hundreds of gangs, each with names taken from the king's titles, such as the Friends of Khufu. The work was divided into teams that competed to see which could move blocks faster. The entire operation was a machine of human effort running like clockwork. The purpose of the pyramid was not merely to impress the living, it was a carefully designed machine for the afterlife. The pyramid acted as a ramp or staircase for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the stars. The internal passages pointed toward specific constellations, and the burial chamber was sealed with immense granite plugs to protect the king's body and his treasures from intruders. The pyramid shape itself held deep symbolic meaning. It represented the primordial mound that first emerged from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation. By placing his tomb at the center of that mound, the pharaoh reenacted the act of creation and guaranteed his own rebirth. No other early civilization built anything with comparable mathematical precision on such a colossal scale. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were made of sun-baked mud brick which eroded over time. The pyramids of Egypt were designed to stay forever, and they have indeed outlasted every empire that rose after them. The Great Pyramid remained the tallest man-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, a testament to the skill and ambition of a society that had learned to organize itself like no other before it. The same system that fed the workers, recorded the harvests, and moved those millions of stones also made possible the medical knowledge, the astronomical observations, and the intricate religious texts that we discussed earlier. Every achievement of Egypt was built on this foundation of precise, large-scale cooperation, and the pyramid stands as its most enduring symbol, a stone mountain raised by human hands for a king who believed he would live again among the gods. The Great Sphinx gazes across the Giza plateau with silent authority. Its human head, believed to represent Pharaoh Khafre, rises above a lion's body carved from a single ridge of limestone. The statue is 240 feet long and 66 feet high. It took years of patient chiseling to transform that natural rock into a creature half man, half beast. The Sphinx was not just decoration. It stood guard over the pyramid complex, a sentinel against chaos and a symbol of the pharaoh's power. The lion's body represented strength and kingship, while the human face gave the monument a divine personality. Pilgrims and officials approaching the pyramids would pass this colossal guardian and instantly understand that they were entering a sacred space where the ruler's authority was absolute. But the Sphinx was not alone. Across Egypt, the pharaohs commissioned enormous statues of themselves and their gods, often hewn from single blocks of stone weighing hundreds of tons. The Colossi of Memnon, two seated figures, each about 60 feet tall and weighing more than 700 tons, greeted travelers at the entrance to a vast mortuary temple near Thebes. They were not carved in a quarry and moved. They were carved directly from the bedrock at the site. The sculptors worked from the top down, using copper chisels, stone hammers, and abrasive sand to slowly reveal the form hidden inside the rock. The precision was astonishing. The faces of the colossi, even after thousands of years of wind and flood damage, still show individual features. These were not generic kings. They were portraits meant to capture the unique presence of Amenhotep III, the pharaoh who built them. Every colossal statue served a religious purpose. The Egyptians believed that a statue could host the Ka, the life force of the person it represented. Offerings of food, incense, and prayers were made at these statues to sustain the spirit in the afterlife. The statue was not a symbol, it was a vessel. That is why the inscriptions on the base often include spells and prayers. That is why the eyes were sometimes inlaid with crystal and obsidian, so the statue could see the rituals performed before it. The sheer size was not for show. A giant statue commanded the landscape. It reminded every observer that the pharaoh was a living god. Even when the king was far away, his stone double stood watch over the land, maintaining order. This tradition of colossal public art had no parallel in the ancient Near East. Mesopotamian kings built massive ziggurats and carved reliefs, but they rarely carved freestanding statues on this scale. The Hittites left rock reliefs, but nothing approaching the size of the Egyptian colossi. Only Egypt had the geological abundance of fine limestone, sandstone, and granite, along with the workforce and the organization to move such immense weights. A single block of granite quarried near Aswan, over 500 miles from the pyramid sites, could be loaded onto a barge and floated down the Nile when the river was in flood. The transport alone was a feat of engineering. The carving demanded generations of skill passed from master to apprentice. These statues outlasted the temples they once guarded. The Colossi of Memnon still sit in the fields near Luxor, their faces worn but still recognizable. The Great Sphinx has lost its nose and much of its beard, but its body remains intact. They have survived earthquakes, floods, and human neglect. They are silent witnesses to a civilization that believed in permanence. And they continue to ask a question that every visitor feels. What did the people who carved these giants believe about themselves? That they would leave such lasting marks on the earth? The stone giants were not the only lasting messages the Egyptians left behind. Across the walls of temples, the surfaces of statues, and the interiors of tombs, a different kind of permanence took form. A system of writing that would endure for more than 3,000 years. Hieroglyphs, the sacred carvings, began as simple pictures. A drawing of an ox meant an ox. A wavy line meant water. These early symbols were direct and easy to understand. But as Egyptian society grew more complex, the writing had to keep pace. Scribes needed to record not just objects but actions, names, and abstract ideas. So the pictographs evolved into something far more flexible. The key innovation was the addition of phonetic signs. A symbol that originally represented a physical object could now also represent a sound. For example, the picture of a mouth, which in Egyptian was the word Ra, could be used to write the sound R in other words. This principle, called the rebus principle, turned hieroglyphs into a hybrid system. Some symbols stood for whole words, others for individual consonants, and still others were used as determinatives, silent symbols that clarified the meaning of the word they accompanied. A scribe might write the sound for house and then add a picture of a house at the end to make sure the reader understood. This layered approach gave Egyptian writing great precision and allowed it to express everything from royal decrees to love poetry. The system was not static. Over the centuries, scribes developed a faster, more cursive form called hieratic, used for everyday documents like tax records, letters, and medical texts. Later, an even more abbreviated script called demotic emerged for administrative and legal use. Yet the original hieroglyphs never disappeared. They remain the formal script for religious inscriptions and monumental carvings, the writing of the gods. This continuity is remarkable. While the writing systems of Mesopotamia, such as Sumerian cuneiform, were replaced by later languages like Akkadian and then Aramaic, and while the Indus Valley script was lost entirely, Egyptian hieroglyphs remained in active use from around 3200 BCE all the way until the 4th century CE. That is a lifespan nearly as long as the entire historical period from the fall of Rome to the present day. What made this possible was the deeply ingrained connection between writing and the divine. The Egyptians believed that hieroglyphs were invented by the god Thoth, the lord of knowledge and wisdom. To write a word was to bring that concept into being. Carving a pharaoh's name on a temple wall was not just recording history, it was ensuring that the king would exist forever. The act of writing itself was a ritual. Scribes were highly respected, often shown in art with the tools of their trade: a reed pen, a palette of ink, and a roll of papyrus. They underwent years of training in special schools attached to temples or government offices. The curriculum was rigorous, involving memorization of hundreds of signs and constant copying of classic texts. The versatility of hieroglyphs also helped them survive. Because the system combined logograms, which represent whole words, with phonograms, which represent sounds, it could adapt to changing pronunciations and even foreign names. When the Greeks and later the Romans ruled Egypt, they had their own names and titles written in hieroglyphs, but the script remained distinctly Egyptian. No other culture fully adopted it because it was so closely tied to Egyptian religion and royal ideology. That very exclusivity made it fragile. When the old temples closed and the priests who could read the sacred signs disappeared, the knowledge faded. By the time the last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved, around the year 394 CE, only a handful of people still understood the ancient symbols. Yet the writing itself never vanished. It covered the walls of every major temple, every tomb, every obelisk. The symbols were too numerous and too durable to be erased. They waited, silent and mysterious, for someone to unlock their meaning. That rediscovery would come nearly 1,500 years later, when the Rosetta Stone provided the key. But before that, the hieroglyphs themselves had already done their work. They had recorded the accomplishments of 30 dynasties, the prayers of countless priests, and the life stories of ordinary Egyptians. They had given a voice to a civilization that otherwise would have remained mute, and in doing so, they had proven that the written word could be as enduring as stone itself. But stone was heavy and slow to carve. For everyday writing, the Egyptians needed something light, portable, and quick to produce. That need gave rise to one of the most transformative inventions in history: papyrus. The papyrus plant grew abundantly in the marshy wetlands of the Nile Delta. Its tall, triangular stalks rose up to 15 feet high, topped with feathery clusters. The Egyptians discovered that if they stripped the outer rind of the stalk, cut the inner pith into long, thin strips, and laid them out in 2 crossed layers, then pressed and dried them under weight, the natural sap would fuse the strips into a strong, flexible sheet. They could then polish the surface with a smooth stone, cut it into rectangles, and glue multiple sheets together to form a roll that could extend for dozens of feet. The result was a writing surface that was lightweight, durable, and easy to transport. A single papyrus roll could hold a long text, a legal contract, a tax record, or a story. Scribes could write on it with a reed pen dipped in carbon ink, and the ink bonded with the fibers so well that the words remained readable for millennia, provided the papyrus was kept dry. This invention changed everything. Before papyrus, the Egyptians had used stone, pottery shards, and wooden boards, but those were heavy, bulky, or limited in size. Papyrus allowed information to flow freely across the kingdom. A pharaoh in Memphis could send a decree to a governor in Thebes, and the scroll would travel by boat in days. Tax records could be compiled and stored in archives. Priests could copy sacred texts and distribute them to temples throughout the land. The bureaucracy of Egypt, which already demanded precise record-keeping of harvests, labor, and trade, became vastly more efficient. Scribes could now produce multiple copies of documents quickly. They could compile lists of workers, inventories of grain, and reports on the annual flood levels of the Nile. This administrative machinery was the backbone that allowed the building of the pyramids and the management of the massive workforce we discussed earlier. Without papyrus, the coordination of thousands of laborers across hundreds of miles would have been nearly impossible. But papyrus did more than support bureaucracy. It nurtured literature, science, and philosophy. The Egyptians wrote medical texts that described surgical procedures and herbal remedies. They composed mathematical treatises that explained how to calculate areas and volumes. They recorded astronomical observations that tracked the movements of the stars and the rising of Sirius, which signaled the annual flood. And they created some of the world's oldest known stories, tales of shipwrecked sailors, of wise men who outwitted death, and of gods who shaped the world. These texts were copied and recopied for generations, passed from temple libraries to private collections. The most famous of these literary works, the story of Sinuer, survives on papyrus rolls that were buried with their owners and rediscovered centuries later. Egypt's near monopoly on papyrus production gave it a unique advantage in the ancient world. The plant grew almost exclusively in the Nile Delta, and the Egyptians carefully controlled its harvest and export. They sold papyrus rolls to the kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and later to the Greeks and Romans. It became the standard writing material of the classical world. Other civilizations had to rely on more perishable surfaces. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed cuneiform signs into soft clay tablets, which were then baked. Clay tablets are heavy, fragile, and difficult to store in large numbers. A single papyrus roll could contain the equivalent of dozens of clay tablets, and it weighed almost nothing. In the Indus Valley, writing was done on materials that have largely decayed, which is why we know so little about their script. In China, early writing was carved on bone or bamboo, which were cumbersome. Egypt's papyrus allowed an entire culture to write down its thoughts, its laws, its prayers, and its stories on a medium that could survive for thousands of years if kept in a dry tomb or a desert cave. That is why we have so much more direct evidence of Egyptian daily life, religion, and administration than we do for most other ancient civilizations. The texts that survive on papyrus are windows into a world that would otherwise be silent. We know the names of ordinary people, we know their complaints, their love poems, their medical treatments, their recipes. We even have fragments of letters written by mothers to their sons serving in the army. This intimate record is unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. The invention of papyrus did more than enable a bureaucracy. It gave a voice to a civilization, and that voice, preserved on these delicate sheets, has carried the thoughts of the Egyptians across 40 centuries, speaking directly to us today. What would our own civilization leave behind if we wrote only on surfaces that could last that long? Egyptian art followed rules that never changed for 30 centuries. A painter in the time of the last pharaohs would have applied the same principles as a painter who lived 2,000 years earlier. The human figure always appeared in what scholars call the composite view. The head was shown in profile, but the eye was drawn from the front as if staring directly at the viewer. The shoulders and upper torso were depicted from the front, while the hips, legs, and feet turned again to the side. This way of drawing the body was not a mistake or a sign of limited skill. It was a deliberate choice to show each part of the body in its most complete and recognizable form. The eye is most recognizable when seen from the front. The shoulders are most powerful when shown square. The legs are most clear in profile, striding forward. By combining these viewpoints, the artist created an image that was not exactly realistic, but was eternally legible. The figure existed outside any single moment in time. It was a permanent, idealized version of a person. Size also carried meaning. This is called hierarchical scale. In an Egyptian tomb painting, the pharaoh towered over his officials, who stood larger than the common workers, who were themselves bigger than the animals and plants in the scene. The relative size of each figure did not reflect their actual physical stature, but their importance in the cosmic order. The king was the largest because he was the living God. His authority filled the space. A servant might be drawn so small that they reached only to the king's knee. This was not an artistic failure. It was a visual statement of rank. Everyone who saw the painting understood instantly who held power. Compare this to Mesopotamian art, where kings sometimes appeared the same size as their attendants, and the focus was on action, like hunting or battle, rather than fixed hierarchy. Egyptian art was designed to show how the world should be, not how it happened to look on a particular day. Color was just as deliberate. The Egyptians used a limited palette of mostly earth pigments: red, blue, green, yellow, black, and white. Each color carried symbolic weight. Red was the color of the desert, of chaos and danger. It was also the color of the god Set, who represented disorder. So red was used sparingly and carefully. Blue and green represented life, water, and rebirth. The sky god Horus was often painted in blue. The green of vegetation stood for new growth and the hope of resurrection. Yellow and gold represented the sun and the eternal flesh of the gods. Skin tones followed a strict rule. Men were painted reddish-brown, women were yellow or pale. This code distinguished genders visually and also connected men to the sun and the active outdoors, while women were linked to the domestic interior. But these conventions were not about realism. They were about clear communication. An Egyptian viewer could read a scene like we read a traffic sign. Every element had a fixed meaning. This rigid system gave Egyptian art an unmistakable identity. If you see a carved relief from the Old Kingdom, you can immediately recognize it as Egyptian, even if you know nothing else about it. The same style persisted through the Middle Kingdom, through the New Kingdom, and even during periods of foreign rule when Greek and Roman artists worked in Egypt. They adopted the local conventions for temple reliefs because the rules were tied to religious purpose. Egyptian art was not made for galleries or for private enjoyment. It was made for temples and tombs for eternity. A statue of a pharaoh was meant to house his spirit forever. If the statue followed the exact rules of proportion and pose, the spirit would recognize itself and dwell inside the stone. Any variation risked breaking that connection. That is why an artist who carved a king with a slightly larger ear or a different angle of the eye was not being creative. He was being careless, and carelessness in art was a spiritual failure. Mesopotamian art evolved noticeably over time. Early Sumerian statues were stiff and abstract. Later Assyrian reliefs became dynamic and narrative, with animals in motion and scenes of hunts. The Greeks, of course, transformed their sculptural style every few generations, moving from the rigid Choros figures to the naturalistic athletes of the classical period. Egyptian art seemed frozen by comparison. But frozen is the wrong word. It was intentionally unchanging because its purpose was to resist change. The world of Ma'at was balanced and complete. There was no need to improve upon perfection, so the artists refined their craft within the same framework for generation after generation, achieving an astonishing level of technical mastery. They could carve a granite statue so smooth that it shone like glass. They could paint a row of geese with such accuracy that each feather was distinct. Their skill was enormous, but it was always channeled into the service of tradition. This consistency is one reason why we can still walk through an Egyptian temple today and feel the same sense of order the ancient worshippers felt. The rows of columns, the repeated images of kings offering to gods, the careful alignment of every figure along a grid line, all of it creates a visual rhythm that feels like a chant or a prayer. The art does not ask for our personal interpretation. It tells us what is true and eternal. That is a very different approach from the art of later civilizations, which often celebrates individuality, emotion, and change. Egyptian art celebrates order, stability, and the triumph of structure over chaos. It is an artistic system built to last, and it has lasted, speaking to us across thousands of years in a language of symbols that we can still partially read. What might we learn if we looked at our own world with that same need for permanence, for meaning in every line and every color? The same desire for permanence shaped how Egyptians understood the soul itself. They did not believe in a single, simple spirit that left the body at death. Instead, they saw a person as made up of several distinct parts, each with its own role in the journey beyond. The most essential was the K, the life force that had entered the body at birth and remained with it after death. The K needed food, drink, and a physical home to survive. This is why tombs were stocked with jars of grain, loaves of bread, jugs of beer, and furniture. Without these offerings, the K would weaken and eventually fade away. The Ba was a different kind of spirit. Often pictured as a human-headed bird, the Ba represented the personality, the unique traits that made a person who they were. During life, the Ba was bound to the body. After death, it could fly free during the day, visiting the world of the living, but it had to return each night to reunite with the body in the tomb. That nightly reunion made the preservation of the physical form absolutely critical. If the body decayed or was destroyed, the Ba would have nowhere to rest, and the soul would be lost. The third component was the Akh, the glorious, transformed spirit that emerged only after a successful judgment. The Akh was the final, eternal form, a being of light who could dwell among the stars or travel the underworld freely. Achieving this state required passing through a dangerous journey. The deceased had to navigate a dark, winding realm filled with gates guarded by hostile demons, pools of fire, and winding paths that could trap the unwary. Every soul needed to know the correct spells, the secret names of the guardians, and the proper responses to the questions asked by the gods. That knowledge was provided by the funerary texts, the most famous of which is the Book of the Dead. These were not single books, but collections of spells written on papyrus rolls or painted on coffin surfaces. They served as a guidebook, a passport, and a map combined. The spells helped the soul remember its own name, open the sealed doors of the underworld, and transform into various forms, such as a falcon or a lotus flower, to pass through obstacles. Without these instructions, the soul could wander forever in confusion and fear. At the heart of the journey lay the Hall of Two Truths, where the Great Judgment took place. This was not a punishment for sin, but a simple and absolute test of balance. The heart of the deceased, which held the record of every thought and action, was placed on one side of a scale. On the other side rested the feather of Ma'at, the principle of truth and order. The deceased had to declare that they had committed no wrongdoing, a long list of denials known as the negative confession. The 42 assessor gods listened to each claim. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul was declared true of voice and allowed to enter the field of reeds, a paradise of lush fields, cool canals, and endless harvest. But if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it would be devoured by a terrifying creature, part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. That second fate was not a temporary punishment. It was complete annihilation, the total end of existence. The stakes could not be higher. This systematic approach to the afterlife was unlike anything in neighboring cultures. The Mesopotamians believed that all souls, regardless of their earthly deeds, went to a dusty, shadowy underworld where they ate bitter clay and drank murky water. There was no judgment, no resurrection, and no hope of a better existence. The early Greeks viewed the underworld as a gloomy realm ruled by Hades, where the dead remained as shades, mere echoes of their former selves. Only a few heroes achieved immortality. But the Egyptians developed a detailed, hopeful vision in which ordinary people, not just kings, could attain eternal life. That vision demanded preparation. Tombs were built not just to house the body, but to serve as eternal homes where the clay could receive offerings. The walls were decorated with scenes of daily life, farming, hunting, feasting, playing music. The Egyptians believed that these images would come to life in the next world, providing the deceased with everything they needed. Even the poorest Egyptians who could not afford a stone tomb would have a simple grave with a few pots of food and a painted wooden figure of a servant to perform labor. The more elaborate the tomb, the more secure the soul. This culture of preparation produced a vast industry of embalming, tomb construction, and funerary art that lasted for millennia. It also created the world's oldest surviving religious literature, a body of work that reveals how deeply the Egyptians thought about what comes after the last breath. They were not afraid of death. They saw it as a transition, a journey that could be mastered with the right knowledge and the right rituals. In that sense, they were not obsessed with death. They were obsessed with life, with ensuring that it continued in an unbroken chain from this world to the next. And that obsession left behind a record of faith and hope that still speaks to us today. What would it mean to live with that same certainty that our story does not end? The preservation of the body was not a practical task, but a sacred duty. For the Egyptians, the physical form was the anchor of existence. Without it, the clay would have no home. The Ba would have no place to return each night, and the entire journey toward becoming an Ak would collapse. This belief drove them to develop a process unlike anything seen in the ancient world: mummification. The word itself comes from a Persian term for bitumen, but the Egyptians called it the House of Beauty. It was a meticulous, delicate, and deeply reverent procedure. The work began as soon as possible after death. Embalmers were not just craftsmen. They were priests who performed their duties in a special workshop, often located near the temples. The entire process took about 70 days, a duration chosen to mirror the cycle of the star Sirius, whose reappearance each summer signaled the life-giving flood of the Nile. The first step was the removal of certain internal organs. The brain was carefully extracted through the nasal passage using long hooks, but they discarded it. They believed the heart, not the brain, was the seat of intelligence and emotion, so it remained in the body. The lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines were removed through a small incision on the left side of the abdomen. These organs were not thrown away. They were washed, dried, and wrapped individually, then placed in 4 special containers called Karnak jars. Each jar was protected by a specific god, one of the 4 sons of Horus. The lids were carved to represent their heads: a human for the liver, a baboon for the lungs, a jackal for the stomach, and a falcon for the intestines. These jars were stored alongside the mummy in the tomb, ensuring that the deceased would have full use of these vital parts in the next world. The body itself was then packed with a natural salt called natron. This salt, harvested from dry lake beds, was a powerful drying agent. The body was covered completely in natron powder and left to dehydrate for 40 days. This step was crucial because moisture promotes decay. By removing all water from the tissues, the embalmers prevented the growth of bacteria and fungi. The skin darkened and hardened, but the overall shape of the body was preserved. After 4 weeks, the natron was brushed away and the body was anointed with oils and resins. These substances not only smelled pleasant, but also helped repel insects and seal the skin. The next phase was the wrappings. Hundreds of yards of linen strips were used, each one cut from old sheets or specially woven cloth. The embalmers wrapped each finger and toe individually, then the arms, the legs, and finally the torso and head. Between the layers, they placed amulets for protection. A heart scarab was placed over the chest to ensure the heart would not testify against the deceased during the judgment. A small figurine of the god Anubis might be tucked into the folds. The entire process was accompanied by prayers and spells recited by the priests. Each wrapping had symbolic meaning, binding the body together against the forces of chaos. The final layer was often coated with molten resin, which hardened into a protective shell. Sometimes the face was covered with a painted mask, and the entire mummy was placed inside a series of nested coffins, each one more elaborate than the last. The cost of this process was enormous. It required skilled labor, rare materials, and weeks of dedicated work. Only the wealthy could afford the full traditional method. For those with fewer resources, simpler procedures were available. The organs might not be removed, or a cheaper resin might be used. The poorest Egyptians were often simply buried in the hot desert sand, which naturally dried the body. In many cases, those natural mummies survived just as well as the elaborate ones. But the desire for preservation was universal. Every Egyptian, no matter their station, hoped to keep their body intact for the journey ahead. No other ancient civilization invested so heavily in this practice. The Mesopotamians buried their dead in clay coffins or simple graves, with no attempt to preserve the flesh. The early Greeks cremated their dead. The Chinese of the same era used jade suits and other techniques, but those were limited to royalty and did not involve the same systematic approach. Only the Egyptians developed a comprehensive theory of bodily preservation, supported by centuries of trial and error. They understood that the heart must stay, that the brain was unnecessary, and that dehydration was the key to stability. They knew how to use resins and oils to protect the tissues and how to wrap the body to maintain its shape. This was not primitive superstition. It was applied anatomy-driven by a powerful faith. The result was a body that could last for thousands of years, a silent companion to the soul on its journey through the underworld. But preserving the body was only half the journey. The soul needed a map, a set of instructions, and a collection of passwords to navigate the dangers of the underworld. That is where the funerary texts came in, and no other ancient civilization produced anything comparable in volume or sophistication. The most famous of these is the Book of the Dead, but that name is a modern invention. The Egyptians called it the Chapters of Coming Forth by Day, a title that captures its real purpose: to allow the deceased to move freely, to see the sun, and to live again in the next world. The Book of the Dead was not a single, standardized book. It was a collection of nearly 200 individual spells, written on papyrus rolls and placed inside the coffin or among the wrappings of the mummy. Each spell served a specific function. Some spells helped the soul remember its own name, because forgetting your name in the underworld meant losing your identity forever. Other spells opened the sealed gates of the afterlife, gave the soul the ability to breathe, or transformed it into a falcon, a heron, or a lotus flower to pass through obstacles. The most important spell is often called the negative confession, where the deceased stood before the 42 assessor gods and declared that they had not committed a long list of wrongs, such as causing suffering, stealing, or speaking falsely. This was not a confession of sin in the modern sense, but a declaration of purity, a way to prove that the soul had lived in harmony with Ma'at. Each papyrus roll was hand-copied by scribes, and the quality varied depending on the wealth of the owner. A luxurious version might include elaborate colored illustrations called vignettes, showing the soul being weighed against the feather, the gods seated in judgment, and the blessed fields of the afterlife. These images were not just decoration. They were visual spells, reinforcing the power of the words. A person who could not read could still understand the story through the pictures. The scrolls were often left partially blank, with spaces for the owner's name to be filled in, because each copy was personalized for the individual who would use it. The Book of the Dead was not the first funerary text. It evolved over centuries. The earliest known religious writings for the afterlife are the pyramid texts, carved into the walls of the burial chambers of Old Kingdom pharaohs around 4,300 years ago. Those texts were strictly for royalty, containing spells to protect the king and help him ascend to the stars. During the Middle Kingdom, the coffin texts appeared, painted on the wooden coffins of nobles and officials. These texts democratized the afterlife, offering protection to anyone who could afford a decorated coffin. The spells expanded, and the illustrations grew more detailed. By the New Kingdom, around 3,500 years ago, the coffin texts had transformed into the Book of the Dead, written on papyrus and available to a wider range of people, from high priests to ordinary scribes. What is remarkable is the sheer scale of this literature. Thousands of surviving papyri, tomb wall texts, and coffin inscriptions contain hundreds of unique spells, some repeated across centuries, others added or modified. This body of work represents an ongoing conversation about what happens after death, a continuous refinement of ideas that lasted for more than 2,000 years. In Mesopotamia, the only significant afterlife text is the Descent of Inanna, a short epic poem. The early Greeks had the Homeric hymns and a few Orphic tablets, but nothing approaching the systematic, instruction manual style of the Egyptian texts. Only in Egypt did a civilization produce a detailed, illustrated guide to the underworld that was meant to be used by the deceased personally. The spells were not just about fear or hope. They were practical tools, like a traveler's handbook. The soul needed to know the names of the ferrymen who could row them across a lake of fire, the passwords to open the doors guarded by giant snakes, and the correct responses to the questions asked by the guardians of each hour of the night. If the soul answered incorrectly, it could be trapped or devoured. The texts provided all the answers. They were a lifeline, a guarantee that with the right knowledge, the journey could be completed successfully. This tradition of preparing for the afterlife produced some of the most beautiful artifacts ever made. The Papyrus of Ani, now in the British Museum, is a stunning example, with gold leaf, vibrant colors, and scenes so detailed that you can see the expression on the face of the goddess Ma'at as she watches the weighing of the heart. It is a work of art, but it was also a deeply personal object created for a specific person who would need it when their time came. The sheer volume of such texts and their evolution over millennia is unmatched in the ancient world. No other culture left behind such a rich, detailed, and hopeful vision of what lies beyond. The Egyptians did not simply hope for an afterlife. They wrote the manual for it. The same faith that guided the dead also shaped the lives of the living. The temples of Egypt were not just houses of worship, they were the beating heart of the economy, the centers of administration, and the keepers of immense wealth. No other ancient civilization built institutions quite like these. The great temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, both dedicated to the god Amun, were far more than stone sanctuaries. They were sprawling cities within cities, covering dozens of acres, filled with workshops, granaries, storehouses, and living quarters for thousands of priests, scribes, and laborers. Karnak alone, over centuries of expansion, grew to become the largest religious complex ever built. Its great hypostyle hall, with its forest of towering columns, could hold the entire population of a small town. But the true power of the temple lay not in its architecture, but in its land. Over generations, pharaohs and wealthy nobles donated vast tracts of fertile soil to the temples. By the New Kingdom, the Temple of Amun at Karnak owned roughly a third of all the farmland in Egypt. This land was worked by tenant farmers who owed a portion of their harvest to the temple. The surplus grain was stored in enormous silos, some large enough to hold thousands of bushels. This stored wealth allowed the temple to feed its workers, pay its priests, and support massive building projects. It also made the temple a banker. In times of shortage, the temple could loan grain to farmers or even to the state itself. The priesthood managed this empire with the efficiency of a modern corporation. The high priest of Amun was one of the most powerful men in Egypt. He controlled a network of officials who collected taxes, settled disputes, and managed the distribution of food. The temple employed scribes who kept detailed records of every sack of grain, every head of cattle, and every bolt of linen that entered or left the storehouses. They recorded the duties of hundreds of workers, from the bakers who made bread for the daily offerings to the barbers who shaved the priests' heads for ritual purity. The temple also owned fleets of boats that transported goods up and down the Nile, linking the temple's estates with the capital and with foreign trade routes. This economic power gave the priesthood a political weight that could rival the pharaoh himself. In theory, the pharaoh was the supreme authority and the chief priest of every god. But in practice, the day-to-day running of the temple was in the hands of the high priest, a position often held by a powerful noble or even a member of the royal family. As the temple's wealth grew, so did the independence of its leaders. During the later New Kingdom, the high priests of Amun in Thebes became so powerful that they effectively ruled Upper Egypt, while the pharaohs remained in the north. This dynamic, a religious institution that could challenge the monarchy, was unique in the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, temple priests were important, but they never controlled enough land to rival the king. In Greece, temples were local sanctuaries without vast economic networks. Only in Egypt did a god's house become a state within a state. The pharaohs were aware of this tension. Some tried to curb the temple's power by reducing donations or appointing loyalists to the priesthood. Others, like Akhenaten, attempted to break the influence of Amun entirely by promoting a new sun god, Aten. But after Akhenaten's death, the priests of Amun swiftly restored their position. The temples had become too integral to the fabric of Egyptian life to be dismantled. They provided education, medical care, and social services that the state could not. They preserved ancient knowledge from astronomy to medicine in their libraries. And they offered ordinary people a direct connection to the divine through festivals and oracles. The great festivals, such as the Opet festival at Luxor, were spectacular public events. The statue of Amun was carried in a sacred boat from Karnak to Luxor, accompanied by music, dancing, and feasting. Thousands of people lined the riverbanks to witness the procession. It was a time when the pharaoh renewed his divine mandate before the eyes of the people. But it was also a reminder that the god's power, channeled through the priesthood, was as essential as the king's. This partnership and occasional rivalry between crown and temple created a unique balance of power. The pharaoh could not rule without the support of the priests, and the priests could not legitimize their authority without the pharaoh. It was a system of mutual dependence that kept Egypt stable for centuries. But it also meant that when the temple grew too strong, the unity of the two lands could fracture. This delicate interplay of religious and political authority was one of the defining features of Egyptian civilization, and it left a legacy that would influence later empires. How did a system built on such a deep partnership between the divine and the mortal eventually begin to unravel? The Egyptians measured time by the stars themselves. For a civilization so dependent on the annual rhythm of the Nile, knowing exactly when the flood would arrive was not just a matter of curiosity, it was a matter of survival. The flood did not arrive on a fixed date. It came when the rains fell far upstream in the highlands of Ethiopia, and the waters took weeks to travel the length of the river. The Egyptians needed a reliable signal, and they found it in the heavens. They noticed that each year, just before the Nile began to rise, a bright star appeared on the eastern horizon at dawn after being absent for about 70 days. That star was Sirius, the brightest in the night sky, which the Egyptians called Subdet. Its reappearance was the herald of the flood. The link between this celestial event and the life-giving waters was so reliable that the Egyptians built their entire calendar around it. They observed that the interval between two heliacal risings of Sirius, that is, when it first becomes visible just before sunrise, was about 365 days. They divided this year into 12 months of 30 days each, giving 360 days. Then they added 5 extra days at the end, called the epigomenal days, to bring the total to 365. Those 5 days were considered outside the normal calendar and were dedicated to the birthdays of 5 major gods: Osiris, Isis, Horus, Set, and Nephthys. It was a practical and elegant solution, but it was not perfect. The actual solar year is closer to 365 and a quarter days. The Egyptian calendar, without a leap year, slowly drifted. Over 120 years, the calendar would fall a full month behind the seasons. A flood that should have come in the first month might arrive in the second, then the third, and so on. This drifting calendar is called the wandering year, and the Egyptians were aware of it. They observed that after about 1,460 years, the calendar would realign with the solar year again, a cycle they sometimes noted. Yet they chose not to add a leap day. Why? Partly because tradition held great power, and partly because the civil calendar was used for administration and religious festivals, while the actual agricultural cycle was followed by direct observation of the Nile and the stars. A farmer did not need the calendar to tell him when to plant. He watched the river itself. So the calendar served a different purpose. It standardized time across the entire kingdom. Scribes used it to date documents, record tax payments, and schedule work shifts. Priests used it to plan temple rituals, which often had to occur on specific days according to the civil calendar, even if those days no longer matched the natural season. This system was so stable that it remained in use for over 2,000 years, long after the fall of the pharaohs. Even the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander, kept the wandering calendar. But the accuracy of the Egyptian solar year did not go unnoticed by the wider world. When Julius Caesar visited Egypt in the 1st century BCE, he encountered the Egyptian calendar and was impressed by its simplicity. He consulted with the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, who helped him design the Julian calendar, which added a leap day every 4 years to correct the drift. The Julian calendar, in turn, became the basis for the Gregorian calendar we use today. This is a remarkable legacy. A calendar created by ancient observers watching a single star rise before dawn has influenced how the entire modern world measures time. The Egyptian achievement in astronomy extended beyond the calendar. They mapped the night sky, identified constellations, and tracked the movements of planets. They recorded the rising and setting of stars to guide temple alignments and predict religious festivals. The sealing of the tomb of Senemadno, a noble from the reign of Hatshepsut, contains one of the oldest known star maps, showing constellations and the positions of the planets. The Egyptians also understood the concept of the decans, 36 groups of stars that rose sequentially each night. Each decan ruled a 10-day period of the year, and their risings were used to mark the hours of the night. This system of dividing the night into 12 parts may have influenced later timekeeping traditions. All of this was done without telescopes, without mechanical clocks, and without a written system of mathematics as abstract as our own. The Egyptians worked with simple tools: sighting rods, plumb lines, and carefully aligned openings in temple walls. Yet their observations were precise enough to build a calendar that served a centralized state for millennia. They understood the cycles of the moon, the sun, and the stars with a clarity that few other ancient cultures matched. The Mesopotamians also developed a calendar, but they used a lunar system that required frequent intercalation of extra months to stay aligned with the seasons. The Egyptians chose a solar model, one that was more stable and better suited to the predictable rhythm of their river. That choice reflects their worldview. They saw order in the cosmos and built their lives around it. The calendar was not just a tool. It was a reflection of Maat, the eternal balance that governed the universe. A balance that the Egyptians believed they had decoded from the stars themselves. And that understanding of cosmic order would influence thinkers far beyond the Nile Valley, leaving a mark on the way we still count our days. Deep in the desert, beneath layers of sand and time, two ancient scrolls were discovered that changed everything we thought we knew about early medicine. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus are not just collections of spells and remedies. They are the oldest surviving medical textbooks in the world, and they reveal a system of healing that was remarkably rational and organized for its era. While other ancient cultures relied heavily on magic and incantations, Egyptian physicians approached illness and injury with observation, diagnosis, and practical treatment. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating back nearly 3,600 years, is a surgical manual. It describes 48 cases of wounds and fractures, arranged from the top of the head downward, much like a modern medical textbook. For each case, the author gives a clear description, a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a recommended treatment. The language is clinical. The physician examines the patient, checks for movement, observes the color of the skin, and asks questions. He then classifies the outcome into one of three categories: an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, or an ailment not to be treated. This was not fatalism. It was honest assessment based on experience. For a fractured skull, the papyrus describes how to feel for the injury with the fingers and how to bind the wound with linen. For a dislocated jaw, it gives instructions on how to manipulate it back into place. The paper even mentions suturing, using needles and thread to close wounds. This level of surgical knowledge was unmatched in the ancient world and would not be surpassed for nearly 2,000 years. The Ebers Papyrus, a longer scroll covering internal medicine, contains over 700 remedies. Some involve herbs like garlic, cumin, and coriander, which we now know have antiseptic and digestive properties. Others use honey, a natural antibacterial agent, to treat burns and wounds. Castor oil was used as a laxative. Pomegranate was used to expel tapeworms. These were not random guesses. They were based on centuries of trial and error, passed down from physician to apprentice. Egyptian doctors even understood the importance of a clean environment and recommended washing wounds with water and wine, which contains alcohol that kills germs. They recognized that certain diseases were linked to the heart and the pulse, which they called the channels of the body. They believed these channels carried air, water, and blood, and that blockages could cause illness. This was not a perfect model, but it was a step toward understanding the body as a system, something no other contemporary culture had attempted. Physicians in Egypt specialized. There were doctors for the eyes, doctors for the stomach, dentists, and even veterinarians. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that Egyptian medicine was highly specialized, with each physician treating only one disease. That level of specialization suggests a sophisticated medical establishment, probably centered around temples and royal courts. Patients came not only from Egypt, but from across the Mediterranean, seeking treatment for everything from broken bones to failing eyesight. The Egyptians even performed surgeries for cataracts, using a needle to push the clouded lens aside, a procedure that would not be reinvented in Europe for centuries. The knowledge was recorded and preserved. Scribes copied medical papyri for generations, adding new observations and treatments. This created a body of medical literature that was constantly updated, a living tradition of learning. Compared to other ancient societies, Egypt was exceptional. In Mesopotamia, medical texts were often mixed with omens and divination. In early Greece, medicine was still deeply intertwined with religious ritual. The Egyptians had their own magical elements, of course, but they also had a clear framework for diagnosis and treatment that was based on observable evidence. They understood that the heart was the center of circulation, that the pulse could be felt at different points in the body, and that the brain, though they dismissed its importance, was at least examined. This was not a primitive system. It was a systematic, practical approach to healing that laid the groundwork for later medical traditions. When Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen studied in Egypt, they absorbed this knowledge and carried it forward. The legacy of Egyptian medicine is not just in the papyri, it is in the very idea that the human body can be studied, treated, and healed through careful observation and skill. The physicians of the Nile were the first to look at a wound and ask not what God caused it, but how can we fix it? And they wrote down the answer. The same practical spirit that guided Egyptian doctors also shaped their approach to numbers and shapes. While other ancient cultures saw mathematics as a theoretical puzzle, the Egyptians treated it as a set of tools for building, measuring, and organizing their world. And they left behind a remarkable record of exactly how they did it. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, a scroll copied by a scribe named Ahmes around 3,600 years ago, is one of the most important documents in the history of mathematics. It contains 84 problems, each one a real-world scenario: how to divide loaves of bread among a group of workers, how to measure the volume of a grain silo, how to calculate the slope of a pyramid, and how to figure out the area of a field after the floodwaters had reshaped it. What is striking is that the Egyptians did not use abstract formulas. They used concrete examples, step-by-step instructions, and a system of numbers that was both simple and clever. They wrote numbers using a decimal system, with separate symbols for ones, tens, hundreds, and thousands. A simple stroke for 1, an arch for 10, a coiled rope for 100, a lotus flower for 1,000. To add or subtract, they combined or removed symbols. Multiplication was done by doubling, a method that might seem slow to us, but was extremely efficient for its time. For instance, to multiply 13 by 17, a scribe would double 13 to get 26, double again to get 52, double again to get 104, then add the appropriate multiples to reach 221. It was a system based on repeated addition, and it worked for everything from counting bricks to calculating taxes. But the most distinctive feature of Egyptian mathematics was the way they handled fractions. They almost never wrote fractions with a numerator greater than 1. Instead, they expressed every fraction as a sum of unit fractions, such as 1/2 plus 1/3. This made calculations more complex, but it also allowed them to divide resources precisely. The Rhind papyrus includes a table that shows how to convert any fraction of the form 2 divided by an odd number into a sum of unit fractions. This was not a theoretical exercise. It was a practical tool for sharing bread, land, and grain among many people. The geometry they developed was equally practical. They knew that the area of the circle could be found by subtracting 1/9 of its diameter and squaring the result. This gave them a value of pi that was remarkably close to the true value, about 3.16, accurate enough for the kind of construction they undertook. They calculated the volume of a truncated pyramid, a frustum, using a formula that modern mathematicians recognize as correct. They understood the concept of slope, which they called the sect, and used it to ensure that the faces of the pyramids rose at the same angle on all 4 sides. The sect was the horizontal distance for a vertical rise of 1 cubit. For the Great Pyramid, the sect was 5.5 palms, meaning that for every cubit of height, the sloping face retreated 5.5 palms horizontally. This simple ratio gave the pyramid its perfect 45-degree angle. Every stone was cut to match that slope, and the entire structure was aligned with the cardinal points, using nothing more than sighting rods and the rising and setting of stars. The most important application of this mathematics came every year after the Nile flood. When the waters receded, the boundaries of fields had been erased. Every farmer needed to know how much land he owned because taxes were based on area. Teams of surveyors, called rope stretchers or harptanoptai, would go out with measuring cords and knotted ropes. They would lay out the fields, measure the lengths of sides, and use their geometry to compute the area of each plot, even irregular shapes. They divided irregular shapes into rectangles and triangles, calculated the area of each part, and added them together. This was not guesswork. It was applied geometry, and it ensured that every farmer paid the correct tax and kept the right land. Without this system, the Egyptian economy would have collapsed into disputes and chaos. The same skills were used to lay out the foundations of temples. The builders would survey the ground, mark the corners with stakes, and use the sect to ensure the walls rose at the correct angle. They knew how to lay out a right angle using a rope with 12 knots, forming a 3-4-5 triangle, the same method that would later be attributed to the Greek mathematician Pythagoras. But the Egyptians were using it at least 1,000 years earlier. They did not write proofs or treatises on abstract geometry. They carved the instructions into their architecture. The temples at Karnak, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the irrigation canals that watered the fields, all of them were built on a foundation of practical mathematics that was passed down from master to apprentice for generations. The numbers were not just symbols on papyrus. They were the invisible framework that held up the entire civilization. Every pyramid, every obelisk, every massive stone block that was moved and set in place rested on the ability of a scribe to calculate, measure, and plan ahead. The Egyptians did not invent mathematics as a separate science. They invented it as a tool for survival and ambition. And by doing so, they created a legacy of precision that still inspires awe today. What does it say about a culture that its greatest monuments are also its most accurate calculation? The same precision that built the pyramids also guided Egypt's reach beyond its shores. While the Nile provided everything needed for survival, the pharaohs understood the true power came from controlling what they did not have. Egypt possessed gold, grain, papyrus, and fine linen in abundance, but it lacked timber, silver, incense, and the exotic oils required for temple rituals and royal burials. To obtain these goods, the Egyptians organized expeditions that pushed far beyond the familiar valley, and they did so with the same careful planning that marked their greatest monuments. The most famous of these journeys was the expedition to the land of Punt, a mysterious region somewhere along the coast of the Horn of Africa. Reliefs on the walls of the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri showed a fleet returning with ships heavily laden, myrrh trees with their roots carefully wrapped, piles of frankincense, ebony logs, ivory tusks, gold rings, and even live baboons and giraffes. The detail in those reliefs tells us that this was not a one-time raid, but a scheduled trade mission organized by the state and carried out by experienced sailors. The Egyptians did not conquer Punt. They traded, offering beads, tools, and weapons in exchange for the luxuries they desired. This was a pattern that repeated throughout Egyptian history. The pharaohs sent trading fleets up and down the eastern Mediterranean coast to Byblos for cedar wood, to the ports of the Levant for olive oil and wine, and further north to the Aegean Islands for pottery and metalwork. Egyptian goods have been found in the ruins of Mycenaean palaces, Minoan villas, and Canaanite cities. In turn, foreign luxury items fill the tombs of Egyptian nobles. This exchange was not just about wealth, it was about diplomacy. The Egyptians understood that gifts could secure alliances more effectively than armies. A pharaoh might send a golden necklace to a Levantine prince or a shipment of grain to a famine-stricken neighbor. In return, he expected loyalty, military support, or access to strategic resources. We know the details of this diplomatic dance from one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 19th century, the Amarna letters. These are hundreds of clay tablets, written in the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia, found in the ruins of the city of Akhetaten, built by the pharaoh Akhenaten. The letters are correspondence between the Egyptian court and the rulers of neighboring kingdoms, from the powerful Hittite and Mitanni empires to the smaller city-states of Canaan. They reveal a world of carefully managed relationships. The letters are filled with exchanges of gifts, requests for gold, negotiations over marriages, and complaints about broken promises. The pharaoh is often addressed as a brother, but the tone reflects a clear hierarchy. Egypt was the senior partner, the superpower that could afford to be generous because it did not need to beg for anything. Yet what is striking is how little Egypt's own culture changed as a result of all this contact. Unlike the empires of Mesopotamia, which were land-based and constantly absorbing new peoples, languages, and ideas from conquered territories, Egypt was protected by geography. To the east and west, vast deserts acted as natural barriers. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea was a buffer rather than a highway for invasion. The only easy entrance was through the Sinai Peninsula in the northeast, a narrow corridor that could be fortified. This isolation meant that foreign traders and diplomats came and went, but they rarely settled in large numbers. Egyptian artists might paint Aegean-style spirals on a palace floor, or a noble might wear a Canaanite-style cloak, but these were fashionable borrowings, not fundamental changes. The core of Egyptian identity remained intact. The language, the religion, the art, the social hierarchy, all stayed recognizably Egyptian for centuries. In contrast, the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians absorbed so many foreign influences that their own cultures evolved dramatically over time. Egypt's geographic good fortune allowed it to dominate trade without being dominated by it. The pharaohs could take what they wanted from the outside world without letting that world change who they were. This is why, even when Egyptian pottery turns up in a Minoan palace or a Mycenaean tomb, it is always clearly Egyptian, never adapted to foreign tastes. And when foreign pottery arrives in Egypt, it is often found in secondary contexts, stored as curiosities or melted down for raw material. The Egyptian worldview was self-sufficient. They believed that their land was the center of the universe, the only place where Maat could be fully realized. Everything beyond the borders was a realm of chaos, worth trading with but not worth imitating. That sense of cultural confidence, backed by the wealth of controlled resources and the security of natural barriers, allowed Egypt to become the first great international power. But what happened when that confidence was tested by a genuine invasion? Inside Egyptian homes, women held a legal power that would not be seen in Europe for thousands of years. A married woman in Egypt could own land, inherit property, and sign contracts in her own name. She could buy, sell, and lease goods without needing a male guardian's permission. If a marriage ended, she could take her share of the assets and leave. These rights were not theoretical. Court records from the New Kingdom show women going before judges to argue over inheritance, demand repayment of debts, and defend their ownership of slaves and land. A woman could even adopt a child to secure her estate. This level of legal autonomy was almost unheard of in the ancient world. In Athens, at the height of its golden age, women were legally minors for their entire lives, unable to own property or represent themselves in court. A Greek woman's father or husband controlled everything she possessed. Roman women had more freedom than the Greeks, but they still relied on a male guardian for major transactions until the late Empire. Egypt, by contrast, had no such restrictions. The law treated women as independent individuals from the start of the historical record. This did not mean every woman wielded great influence. Most worked alongside their husbands in fields or workshops, managing households and raising children, but their ability to hold wealth gave them a tangible stake in society. A woman who inherited land could rent it out, sell it, or pass it to her own children. If her husband fell ill or died, she could take over the family business. The legal system recognized her as a full person, not a possession. The same principle applied to religious life. Women served as priestesses, musicians, and chantresses in temple ceremonies, roles that required education and carried prestige. The most powerful religious office a woman could hold was the god's wife of Amun, a position that rose to prominence during the New Kingdom. The god's wife was not a king, but she wielded enormous influence over the temple complex at Karnak, which was one of the wealthiest institutions in the world. She controlled vast estates, received tributes, and directed the affairs of the priesthood. Some gods' wives were daughters of pharaohs, placed in the role to secure the crown's influence. Others, like the powerful female pharaoh Hatshepsut, used the title as part of her own royal identity. This office gave women direct access to political and economic power, a level of authority that no woman in Greece or Rome ever achieved. 3 women went even further and ruled as pharaohs in their own right. The earliest was Sobekneferu, who reigned at the end of the 12th dynasty. She is shown in statues wearing both the traditional female dress and the male regalia of kingship, the head cloth, the kilt, and the false beard. She took on the full titles of a pharaoh and was depicted performing royal rituals. Her reign was brief, but it established a precedent. Later, Hatshepsut became one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history. She did not simply act as a regent for her stepson, she declared herself king, built a magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, and led a major trade expedition to the land of Punt. Her monuments show her with the body of a man, because the king was an office, not a biological gender. She ruled for over 20 years, and Egypt prospered under her leadership. After her death, attempts were made to erase her from official records, but the evidence of her reign remained carved in stone. Centuries later, Tasret also took the throne as pharaoh at the end of the 19th dynasty. She completed her husband's tomb in the Valley of the Kings and issued decrees in her own name. Her rule was cut short by political turmoil, but her tomb and monuments survive as testimony to her authority. These women were exceptions, but the very fact that they could become pharaohs at all tells us something about Egyptian society. The concept of kingship was tied to the office, not to the gender of the person holding it. A woman who had the right royal blood, the support of the priesthood, and the will to lead could ascend to the highest position in the land. No Greek city-state ever allowed a woman to rule independently as a monarch. Rome had powerful imperial women like Livia and Agrippina, but they ruled through their husbands and sons, never as sole emperors. In Egypt, female pharaohs sat on the throne of Horus. They were not consorts or regents, they were kings. That is a distinction that sets Egypt apart. The legal and social freedom that women enjoyed was not a later development. It was woven into the culture from the earliest dynasties. A woman's ability to own property, represent herself in court, and even rule the kingdom meant that Egypt functioned with a different set of assumptions about gender and power. Those assumptions would take the rest of the Western world more than 2,000 years to even approach, and they raise a question that lingers in the shadow of the pyramids. If a civilization could grant such rights so long ago, what does that say about the choices made by the ones that followed? The new kingdom transformed Egypt from a protected river kingdom into a military superpower. For centuries, the deserts and the sea had kept invaders at bay, but by around 1550 before the Common Era, the world had changed. Foreign powers had learned to cross those barriers, and Egypt had learned that isolation was no longer a guarantee of safety. The response was a revolution in warfare that turned the pharaohs into conquerors. The most visible symbol of this transformation was the chariot. Lightweight, fast, and pulled by 2 horses, the Egyptian chariot was not a heavy battle wagon. It was a mobile platform for archers. A driver and a bowman stood together on a woven floor, bouncing over rough ground at speeds that infantry could never match. The chariot allowed a small force to strike quickly, retreat, and strike again. It turned the battlefield into a fluid space where speed and coordination mattered more than sheer numbers. The Egyptians did not invent the chariot. They learned it from the Hyksos, a foreign people who had ruled parts of northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. But once they mastered it, they improved it. Egyptian chariots were lighter and more maneuverable than those of their neighbors, built from local wood and leather, with 6 spokes in the wheels for strength. A well-trained crew could rain arrows into enemy ranks from a distance, then close in for pursuit when the formation broke. The bow itself was equally advanced. The Egyptian composite bow was made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together and curved backward. This design stored more energy than a simple self-bow, allowing an arrow to penetrate armor at longer ranges. Archers trained from youth, developing the shoulder strength to draw these powerful weapons. In battle, they could release 10 or more arrows per minute. When volleys came from chariots and infantry at the same time, the effect was devastating. The archer became the most feared soldier on the field, and Egypt produced them in numbers that no neighboring kingdom could match. But the army was not just about offense. The Egyptians also built an extensive system of fortifications, especially along their borders and in conquered territories. Fortresses in Nubia, the region to the south, were massive structures with thick mud brick walls, moats, and parapets. The fortress at Buen, for example, covered several acres, with towers spaced evenly along its perimeter and a drawbridge over a dry ditch. Inside, soldiers lived in barracks, stored grain and water, and maintained workshops for repairing weapons and chariots. These forts were not just military posts. They were centers of administration, where Egyptian officials collected tribute, regulated trade, and ensured that the local population remained loyal. The network of forts along the Nile in Nubia created a secure corridor that allowed Egypt to control the flow of gold, ivory, and exotic goods from the south. This brings us to the unique nature of the Egyptian empire. Unlike the Assyrians, who often deported conquered populations and imposed direct rule, or the Romans, who built colonies and granted citizenship, the Egyptians preferred a lighter touch. In Nubia, they appointed a governor called the King's Son of Cush, who oversaw the region but left local chiefs in place as long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. The tribute was collected annually and shipped north in boats. It included gold dust, ebony logs, leopard skins, ostrich feathers, and slaves. In return, the Nubian elites received Egyptian goods, titles, and protection. This system was efficient because it required fewer soldiers to maintain order. The local leaders had a stake in the empire's success. They kept their positions, their wealth, and their status, as long as they acknowledged the pharaoh's authority. In the Levant, the region that includes modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, the system was even looser. The Egyptian empire in the Levant was not a territorial empire in the modern sense. It was a network of city-states that swore loyalty to the pharaoh and sent tribute in exchange for military protection. The Amarna letters, which we mentioned earlier, show the relationship clearly. Local kings wrote to the pharaoh, begging for gold, complaining about rivals, and swearing eternal loyalty. They addressed the pharaoh as my lord and referred to themselves as your servant. When a city-state rebelled, the pharaoh could send a military expedition to punish it and restore order. But most of the time he relied on the local rulers to govern their own people and collect the tribute. This was empire by proxy, and it worked remarkably well for centuries. The reason it worked was the Nile. The river was the logistical backbone of the entire military system. Armies could march along the river banks, but more importantly, they could be supplied by boat. Grain, weapons, spare chariot parts, and medical supplies all traveled downstream faster than any army could march. A single cargo boat could carry what would take hundreds of donkeys to move. This allowed the pharaohs to maintain large forces far from home without the constant threat of starvation. In Nubia, the northward current was gentle, and boats could sail upstream using the prevailing wind. In the Levant, the Egyptian army had to march overland, but the coastal plain was relatively flat, and supply depots were established at key points along the route. The river and the sea together gave Egypt a mobility that landlocked empires could not match. The professional army that emerged during the New Kingdom was a standing force, not a temporary levy. Soldiers were paid in land grants and gold. They served for decades, building careers from charioteer to general. When a soldier retired, he often received a plot of land that could support his family for life. This created a class of military families who were loyal to the pharaoh and invested in the empire's stability. The army became a pillar of the state, and its leaders often rose to positions of great influence, sometimes even founding new dynasties. This was a far cry from the earlier periods when the pharaoh relied on local governors to raise troops. The New Kingdom army was a professional institution, and its professionalism made Egypt the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean for over 400 years. But even the best army could not protect a civilization from the slow erosion of time and fortune. The same system that built the empire also sowed the seeds of its decline. How did a nation that commanded such power eventually lose its grip on the world it had conquered? The greatest threat to Egypt's dominance arose from within the royal palace itself. Around the year 1350 before the Common Era, a pharaoh named Amenhotep IV ascended the throne and within a few years set in motion a revolution that would shake the foundations of Egyptian civilization. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning one who is beneficial to the Aten, and declared that the Aten, the physical disk of the sun, was the supreme and only God. This was not a gradual reform. It was a direct assault on the entire religious establishment that had governed Egypt for nearly 2,000 years. The temples of Amun, the most powerful god of the New Kingdom, were closed. Their vast estates were seized. The statues of the old gods were defaced or destroyed. The priesthood of Amun, which had grown wealthy and influential beyond measure, was stripped of its authority overnight. No other pharaoh had ever attempted anything like this. In Mesopotamia, kings occasionally promoted one god above others, but they never denied the existence of the rest of the pantheon. Akhenaten went further. He insisted that the Aten was the only god, that he alone knew the Aten's will, and that all other forms of worship were false. This was an unprecedented experiment in what we might call a form of focused divine kingship, though not quite monotheism in the modern sense, because the pharaoh himself remained a divine intermediary. To establish this new order, Akhenaten built a brand new capital city on the east bank of the Nile in a region that had never been settled before. He called it Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten. Today we know it as Amarna. The city was laid out along a royal road with palaces, temples, and administrative buildings stretching for miles. The temples of the Aten were radically different from traditional Egyptian temples. They had no dark inner sanctuaries where only priests could enter. Instead, they were open to the sky, with altars exposed to the direct rays of the sun. The Aten was depicted not as a humanoid figure, but simply as a sun disk with rays ending in tiny hands, each one holding the Ankh symbol of life. The message was clear: the Aten gave life directly to the pharaoh and through him to all of Egypt. No other gods were needed. The artistic changes were just as dramatic. For centuries, Egyptian art had followed strict conventions, idealized figures, rigid poses, and timeless proportions. Akhenaten shattered those rules. The art of the Amarna period became naturalistic, almost exaggerated. The pharaoh was shown with an elongated face, a narrow waist, wide hips, and a protruding belly. His features were not idealized. They were unique, unmistakable, and personal. This was a deliberate break from the past. The royal family was depicted in intimate, everyday scenes that had no precedent in Egyptian art. One famous relief shows Akhenaten and his chief wife Nefertiti playing with their daughters, sitting casually, kissing them, holding them on their laps. This was not remote divinity. This was a family, presented as a model of harmony under the Aten's light. The art was a visual declaration that the old ways were dead. But the revolution was built on sand. Akhenaten's focus on religious reform came at a terrible cost. He neglected the traditional military campaigns that had secured Egypt's empire. The Amarna letters, the clay tablets we mentioned earlier, are filled with desperate pleas from vassal kings in the Levant who were being attacked by neighbors and found no response from the pharaoh. Egypt's influence in the region began to crumble. Inside the country, the old priesthood, though suppressed, had not disappeared. They waited, watched, and preserved their knowledge. When Akhenaten died after roughly 17 years of rule, his successor was a young boy named Tutankhaten, who soon changed his name to Tutankhamen and abandoned the city of Amarna. The capital returned to Thebes. The temples of Amen were reopened and restored. The old gods were brought back with elaborate ceremonies. The Aten temples at Amarna were torn down, their blocks reused as filler for later construction. Akhenaten's name was chiseled off monuments, erased from king lists, and struck from official memory. The experiment was over. What makes this period so remarkable is not just that it happened, but that it was so thoroughly reversed. No other ancient civilization attempted such a radical break from its own religious tradition, and then, within a single generation, returned to the old ways as if nothing had happened. The Amarna period reveals both sides of Egyptian civilization, the capacity for astonishing change and an even deeper commitment to continuity. The system could bend, but it could not be broken, and the speed of the reversal tells us how deeply the traditional beliefs were rooted in the identity of the people. Akhenaten tried to rewrite the story of Egypt, but in the end, Egypt rewrote him out of its story. The question that lingers is whether any society can truly erase its own past, or whether the echoes of such a bold experiment continue to resonate long after the monuments have been dismantled. The seeds of decline were planted not by foreign armies, but by the very forces that had once made Egypt strong. The reliable rhythm of the Nile began to falter. Over several centuries, a series of droughts and lower flood levels struck the region. When the river failed to rise high enough, the land did not receive the rich silt that had fed Egypt for thousands of years. Harvests shrank. Empty granaries meant hungry people, and hungry people grew restless. The central government, already weakened by the cost of maintaining a vast empire, struggled to respond. Local governors, called nomarchs, began to assert their own authority. They hoarded grain, raised their own armies, and stopped sending tribute to the pharaoh. The unity that had held the two lands together for so long began to crack. Internal strife broke out as rival regions competed for scarce resources. Tombs were robbed, not just by common thieves, but by officials who were supposed to protect them. The old order was fraying, and when a civilization weakens from within, outsiders take notice. The first major foreign invaders to break through Egypt's defenses were the Assyrians. Around 670 years before the Common Era, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon marched his army across the Sinai and into the Nile Delta. The Egyptian forces, divided and poorly led, could not stop him. He captured the city of Memphis, seized the royal family, and appointed local rulers as his vassals. For a time, Egypt was a province of the Assyrian Empire. But the Assyrians did not stay long. Their own empire was overstretched, and the memory of Egyptian independence never died. Within a few decades, a native dynasty rose again from the city of Sais in the Delta. They expelled the Assyrians and briefly restored a semblance of native rule. This period, known as the Site Renaissance, was a deliberate return to the old ways. Art, religion, and architecture consciously imitated the styles of the Old Kingdom, as if trying to reclaim a lost golden age. But the recovery was fragile. A new and more powerful empire was rising to the east, the Persians. In 525 before the Common Era, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt. He defeated the last Site pharaoh and established Persian rule. The Persians were more systematic than the Assyrians. They divided Egypt into provinces, appointed Persian governors, and demanded heavy taxes. They also respected Egyptian religion at first, even performing traditional rituals. But later Persian rulers grew harsh, suppressing rebellions with force and damaging temples. Egyptian resentment simmered. For over a century, the Persians ruled, interrupted by brief periods of native independence that never lasted long. The old confidence, the belief that Egypt was eternally protected, had eroded. Then came Alexander the Great. In 332 before the Common Era, he marched into Egypt without a battle. The Persian governor surrendered, and the Egyptian people welcomed Alexander as a liberator. He was crowned pharaoh in Memphis and made a pilgrimage to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where he was declared the son of the god. To the Egyptians, this was familiar, a foreign conqueror who accepted the ancient rituals and presented himself as a legitimate king. But Alexander did not stay. He left behind a Greek general named Ptolemy to govern. When Alexander died, Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh and founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. This was the Ptolemaic period, and it was unlike anything that had come before. The new rulers were Greek. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and built Greek-style cities, most famously Alexandria. But they also understood that to hold Egypt, they had to honor its traditions. So they did something remarkable. They blended the two cultures. The Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs in the full Egyptian style. They wore the double crown, performed rituals in temples, and had their names written in hieroglyphs. At the same time, Greek remained the language of government, and Greek settlers filled the army and administration. The most famous of these rulers was Cleopatra VII, who spoke Egyptian, Greek, and several other languages, and who consciously styled herself as the living goddess Isis. This blending, called syncretism, created new forms of worship. The god Serapis was invented by the Ptolemies, combining aspects of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with Greek features. The cult of Isis, already popular in Egypt, spread across the entire Mediterranean world. Temples to Isis were built in Rome, Greece, and as far away as Britain. Egyptian priests continued their ancient rituals, but now they did so under the patronage of Greek-speaking kings. The old hieroglyphic inscriptions grew fewer, replaced by Greek and Demotic scripts. Yet the core of Egyptian religion, the mummification, the rituals, the belief in the afterlife, survived. Even when the Romans conquered Egypt in 30 before the Common Era, after Cleopatra's defeat, the pattern continued. Roman emperors were depicted as pharaohs on temple walls, offering incense to Egyptian gods. The cults of Isis and Osiris remained active for centuries. The temples at Philae and Dendera were still being decorated with traditional reliefs as late as the 3rd century of the Common Era. Egyptian culture did not vanish when the last native pharaoh fell. It adapted, changed, and persisted in new forms. The language shifted, the political power moved elsewhere, but the ideas, the art, the rituals, and the deep belief in a cosmic order did not die. They were carried forward by priests, by merchants, by travelers who took the worship of Isis to every corner of the Roman world. Even after the last hieroglyph was carved, even after the temples fell silent, the memory of Egypt lived on. It was remembered in the writings of Greek and Roman historians, in the stories of travelers, and in the stones that still stood along the Nile. The civilization that had made itself eternal had, in a sense, succeeded. Its body was no longer a political empire, but its soul had been woven into the fabric of human history. The question is not whether Egypt fell, but whether any civilization can truly disappear when its ideas are still alive. The stones had never stopped speaking, but for over 1,000 years no one could understand them. When Napoleon Bonaparte led his army into Egypt in 1798, he brought not only soldiers, but a small army of scholars, scientists, artists, engineers, and linguists. Their mission was to document everything they saw: the temples, the statues, the obelisks, the vast and mysterious ruins that had been half buried in sand for centuries. The result was a monumental publication called the Description de l'Egypte, a series of volumes filled with detailed drawings and engravings that stunned Europe. For the first time, people outside Egypt saw the full splendor of the ancient civilization: the towering columns of Karnak, the silent face of the Sphinx, the intricate carvings that covered every surface. But those carvings were still a locked door. No one could read the strange signs that decorated every temple and tomb. A few classical authors had mentioned Egyptian writing, but the knowledge of how to interpret it had vanished with the last priests who used it, over 1,000 years earlier. The key to unlocking that door was discovered by accident. In 1799, a French soldier repairing a fortification near the town of Rosetta uncovered a slab of black stone about 4 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. It was inscribed with 3 different scripts: hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Ancient Greek. The Greek portion could be read easily, and it revealed that the stone carried a decree issued by priests in 1966 before the Common Era. If the other 2 sections said the same thing, then scholars had a translation key. For over 20 years, the race was on. The most famous competitors were the English physicist Thomas Young and the French linguist Jean-François Champollion. Young made early progress by identifying the hieroglyphic group for Ptolemy, a Greek royal name. But Champollion went further. He realized that hieroglyphs were not purely symbolic or purely phonetic. They were both. Some signs stood for whole words, others for sounds, and the same sign could serve either role depending on context. Champollion systematically compared the hieroglyphic and demotic versions of the Rosetta Stone with known Greek names, and he began to reconstruct the ancient Egyptian language. His breakthrough came in 1822, when he announced he could read the cartouche of the pharaoh Ramses II. It was a moment of intellectual triumph. The silent stones began to speak. Champollion's decipherment opened a floodgate. Suddenly, the thousands of inscriptions on temple walls, tombs, and papyri were no longer mysterious decorations. They were records of history, religion, poetry, and law. Scholars could now read the names of pharaohs, the accounts of battles, the prayers to gods, and the personal letters of ordinary people. A whole civilization emerged from the fog of myth into the light of documented history. This was the birth of Egyptology, a new science that would draw generations of explorers, archaeologists, and linguists to the Nile Valley. They came to dig, to copy, and to carry away treasures. The great museums of Europe, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, filled with colossal statues, jeweled coffins, and papyrus scrolls. The hunt for ancient Egypt became an international obsession, and it was fueled by the sheer scale and beauty of what was being uncovered. Every season of excavation revealed something new: the tomb of a previously unknown pharaoh, a cache of mummies, a lost temple, a text that rewrote history. The names of the discoverers became famous: Giovanni Battista Belzoni, who removed the colossal bust of Ramses II from Thebes and shipped it to London; Howard Carter, who in 1922 uncovered the nearly intact tomb of Tutankhamun, a discovery that set off a global craze for all things Egyptian. The golden mask of the boy king became one of the most recognizable images in the world. But the rediscovery of Egypt was not just about treasure hunting. It was about resurrection. The stones had been silent for so long that many people thought the Egyptian language was lost forever. Champollion's work proved that no knowledge, once written down, is truly beyond recovery if the key can be found. The hieroglyphs, which had been dismissed by some as mere picture writing, were revealed as a sophisticated system capable of expressing abstract ideas, complex grammar, and poetic nuance. The Egyptians had carved their thoughts into the most durable of all surfaces, and after 2,000 years of silence, those thoughts were heard again. This modern fascination is itself a testament to what made Egypt unique. No other ancient civilization has captured the modern imagination so powerfully. The pyramids are still the most recognizable ancient structures on Earth. The mummy is a universal symbol of mystery. The very word pharaoh carries a weight that no other ancient title bears. The reason is not just the age of the monuments or their size. It is that the Egyptians built for eternity, and they succeeded. Their temples still stand. Their art still amazes. Their words, once deciphered, still speak directly to us across a gulf of millennia. They asked the same questions we ask: who are we? What happens after death? How do we build something that lasts? Their answers, carved in stone and written on papyrus, are still here, waiting for us to listen. And as long as we keep asking those questions, Egypt will never truly be a thing of the past. Despite everything we have learned from the Rosetta Stone and 2 centuries of excavation, ancient Egypt still guards its secrets like a locked door that refuses to open. Walk onto the Giza plateau today, and you will see the 3 great pyramids standing exactly where they were placed 4,500 years ago. But how exactly were those 2 million stone blocks lifted into position, some weighing as much as 80 tons? The ramps, the levers, the careful calculations, we have theories in abundance, but no single explanation satisfies every detail. The ancient builders left no instruction manuals, no construction blueprints. They carved their triumphs into stone, but kept the methods to themselves. So the question lingers: did they use a straight ramp, a spiral ramp, or something else entirely that we have not yet imagined? The mystery is not a failure of archaeology. It is a reminder that the Egyptians were not trying to explain themselves to us. They were building for their own eternity, and they took their engineering secrets to the grave. The same puzzle surrounds Akhenaten and his religious revolution. We know he promoted the Aten as the supreme power, closed the temples of Amun, and built a new capital at Amarna. But what did he truly believe? Was his Aten a single, universal god, the first known attempt at a form of monotheism? Or was it simply a political tool to break the power of the priesthood and concentrate authority in his own hands? We have his poetry, his art, his letters, but we do not have his inner thoughts. No personal diary, no confession of faith has survived. The man himself remains a silhouette, a figure whose convictions we can reconstruct only through the fragments he chose to leave behind. He may have been a visionary, a heretic, or a pragmatist, and the truth is probably a blend of all three that we will never fully untangle. Then there are the tombs that have not been found. The Valley of the Kings has yielded dozens of royal burials, but the resting places of some of the most famous pharaohs remain hidden. Where is the tomb of Alexander the Great, who was crowned pharaoh and whose body was said to have been brought to Egypt? Where is the burial of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, who chose to die together rather than surrender to Rome? Every few years, a new excavation announces a promising lead, a buried chamber, a foundation deposit, a tantalizing inscription. Yet the sands do not give up their treasures easily. They have a way of keeping what they hold, and that is part of the allure. The unanswered questions do not diminish Egypt's legacy. They enrich it. A civilization that can still surprise us, that can still provoke debate and speculation after thousands of years, is one that has truly achieved something eternal. It never grows old. It never becomes fully known. It remains a horizon we can approach but never reach. And that is exactly what keeps us looking, keeps us wondering, and keeps us coming back for more. Every attribute we have explored, from the reliable rhythm of the Nile to the divine authority of the pharaoh, from the intricate preparation for the afterlife to the colossal pyramids that still pierce the sky, all of these elements work together to create a civilization that refused to fade. Geographic stability gave Egypt the agricultural surplus that freed people to build, to write, to heal, and to dream. The concept of divine kingship wove religion and politics into a single unbreakable thread, ensuring that the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but the living embodiment of cosmic order. That order, Maat, governed everything from the stars to the courtroom, and the belief in an afterlife so detailed, so hopeful, and so attainable shaped every tomb, every statue, every inscribed spell. The monumental architecture was not an act of vanity, but of faith, a stone declaration that permanence was possible. The artistic continuity, unchanging for 3,000 years, was a visual language of eternity. And the intellectual achievements in medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and writing proved that this was not a culture of superstition alone, but of observation, calculation, and practical genius. Each of these threads alone is remarkable, but together they wove a fabric so strong that it has survived the collapse of empires, the rise of new religions, and the erosion of millennia. Egypt did not merely endure as a memory. It endures as a presence that still challenges us, still inspires us, and still asks us to consider what it means to build something that outlasts our own brief lives. The stones are still standing, the papyri are still legible, and the questions are still alive. If you want to keep exploring the mysteries of ancient civilizations, the stories hidden in desert sands, and the lessons that history whispers to the present, consider subscribing to join us on every future journey. Thank you for watching, for thinking, and for letting the voice of a world long gone speak to you once more. The Nile still flows, and the story never truly ends.